Hello everyone and welcome to the ninth video for Life on Earth. You should now know all about mutations and adaptation, and you should be able to pause the video and answer the questions before I go over the answer. So the questions are: what is meant by the term mutation? And then the next question is: it is thought that Darwin's finches evolved from one type of ancestral finch. The diagram below shows examples of different species of Darwin's finch. For AI, what two observations can be made from the diagram about the structures of the finch's beaks? And for II, name one environmental factor which has led to this variation. So the answers are that a mutation is a random change to the genetic material. The two observations that could have been made about the beaks would be that the beak size and the beak shape are different. The beak length, the beak width, and the beak depth are different. So any two of these for 1 point. And then name one environmental factor which has led to this variation. So this could be competition for food or availability of food. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If you struggled to get the answers, remember you can go back and watch the last video again, or you can watch the parts of the last video again that you were struggling with as many times as you want to. Today we're going to learn about key area 6, evolution of a species, and we are looking in particular at natural selection and speciation. If you want the worksheets to go with the video, remember to pause the video and go to Free Life on Earth, 6 evolution of a species, 2 consumables and activities. The PowerPoint is found in PowerPoint and is called 6 evolution of a species. So today we're going to be learning about natural selection and speciation. Our learning intention is to be able to state that variation within a population makes it possible for a population to evolve over time in response to changing environmental conditions. We're also going to be able to explain that species produce more offspring than the environment can sustain. Natural selection or survival of the fittest occurs when there is selection pressure. The best adapted individual in the population will survive to reproduce, passing on the favourable alleles that confer the selective advantage. These alleles increase in frequency within the population. They also need to identify that speciation occurs after part of the population becomes isolated by an isolation barrier, which can be geographical, ecological, or behavioural, and different mutations occur in each subpopulation. They also need to be able to state that natural selection selects for different mutations in each group due to different selection pressures. Each subpopulations evolve until they become so genetically different that they can no longer interbreed and they form two species. To be successful, you will be able to explain the different stages of natural selection and be able to put them in order, and you'll be able to explain the different stages of speciation and be able to put them in order. Last video we were talking about how Charles Darwin noticed adaptations in finches, so now we are going to look at natural selection. Charles Darwin suggested that evolutionary changes were produced by natural selection and everything comes from a common ancestor. What exactly is natural selection? So sexual reproduction produces more offspring than the environment can support, and all of the offspring are very different, and this is because of inherited variation. And all of these different offspring will compete to live. So some will die because of disease, some will die due to competition for food, some will be eaten by predators, and some will die because of exposure to harsh environmental conditions. Only the strongest, the fastest, the best insulated survive and breed. This is called survival of the fittest and is natural selection. So the fittest offspring then produces more offspring that the environment can't support, and the cycle repeats again over many generations. Let's look at this again. So the rabbit produces more offspring than the environment can support. Some die due to competition, some die due to disease, some die due to predation, and some die due to the harsh environment. Only the best. So these offspring will survive and they will be able to reproduce, which will pass on these favourable alleles that have kept them alive to their offspring. So they'll produce more offspring than the environment can support. Then they will struggle to survive, so there'll be predation, competition, disease, and harsh environment. So again, only the strongest will survive and will be able to reproduce. So only the fittest survive, and this is called natural selection. So let's summarise this in the one diagram. So you've got sexual reproduction produces many offspring, So you've got inherited variation means that organisms are different from each other. There's a struggle for survival, so there's death due to harsh environmental conditions, death from predation, death due to competition, and death due to disease. So only the fittest will survive and pass on its favourable characteristics. So mating and offspring produce favoured characteristics are passed on. So offspring again then struggle for survival, and only the fittest survive, pass on their characteristics and alleles to the next generation, and this process just repeats itself. So make sure you learn this diagram before you move on to the next part of the video. So this diagram is saying much of the same thing, so maybe pause the video and try to write out the stages of natural selection without looking at the screen, and then come back to it. So sexual reproduction produces more offspring than the environment can support. You've got your differences in your offspring that are expressed in the phenotype. Remember, that's their physical characteristic. So some weaker rabbits die, and some are caught by predators. You've got competition, disease, harsh environmental conditions. So only the healthiest, strongest, fastest survive, so survival of the fittest, and they pass on their favourable characteristics down to their offspring when they interbreed. And then we have the same again, so more offspring produced than the environment can support. The best adapted survive and pass on their genes, so poorly adapted die, and poorly adapted die, and only the strongest will survive, which is natural selection. So make sure you understand the process of natural selection before you move on to the next part of the video. So to summarise natural selection in a paragraph, we would need to write that species produce more offspring than the environment can sustain. Natural selection or survival of the fittest occurs when there are selection pressures. So that might be predation, competition, disease. So the best adapted individuals in a population survive to reproduce. They pass on their favourable alleles, which is their genes, which confer this selective advantage to the beneficial ones. These alleles then increase in frequency within a population. So you need to write this out over and over again, and you need to learn this paragraph for natural selection, and you need to be able to put the stages of natural selection in order. So do that before you move on. So species produce more offspring than the environment can sustain. Natural selection or survival of the fittest occurs when there's selection pressure. So that's like predation, competition, disease. The best adapted individual in the population will survive, and it will reproduce. It will pass on its favourable alleles that confer the selective advantage. These alleles will increase in frequency within the population. Let's look at the word selective advantage in more detail. Pause the video and list the adaptations that would help a small mouse like mammal survive in the desert, and list the adaptations that would help the same type of animal survive in the Arctic. So let's look at two different rodents. So we have Ronald the rat and Lenny the lemming. So write down beside your list which one would match the description that you've just put for the one that would survive in the desert and what one would survive in the Arctic. So, Ronald and Lenny both visit Scotland for Christmas. Who's going to have the selective advantage, Ronald or Lenny? Pause the video and try to answer it before I go over the answer. So the answer would be that Lenny the lemon would have the advantage. It would have the selective advantage because it has a thick coat, so it's going to be nice and cosy for our bad Scottish weather. But if these weather conditions change, so like we were on the beach in Hawaii, then who's going to have the selective advantage now? Is it going to be Ronald the rat or Lenny the lemming? So pause the video and try to answer it before I tell you the answer. So it would be Ronald the rat, and that's because he is smaller, he's got a less thick coat, and he would be able to survive in the hot conditions without overheating. Now commonly the SQA will ask you about the peppered moth. You get two types, the light coloured moth and the melanic moth, which is the dark one. And you get asked what one would have the selective advantage in different conditions. So what one would have the selective advantage here? Well, it would be moth number 1, this one here. Why do you think that is? Pause the video and write down what you think. The answer is because it's camouflaged, so it's less likely to be seen by its predators, whereas this one stands out, so it's more likely to be seen. Well done if you managed to get that. Usually in class we would look at the storyboard, which you can find in consumables, and it is labelled 6.5. And your challenge with this is to make a diagram or flowchart to show how natural selection was responsible for the changes in the peppered moth population. You must use the term selective advantage inherited genes. So pause the video until you can complete this. So let's look at natural selection with peppered moths as an example. The peppered moth exists in two colours. You get your light form and you get your melanic form, which is your dark coloured one. Each has a selective advantage in different environments. Before the Industrial Revolution, light moths had a selective advantage because they were well camouflaged against lichen-covered trees. They were better able to avoid predation from birds because they could hide. But during the 19th century, pollution killed off some of the lichen, and soot deposits caused tree bark to appear dark. So the light moths no longer had the selective advantage because they could no longer camouflage against the tree, so they were more likely to be eaten by the birds. So instead, the dark moths had a greater chance of reproducing and passing on this favourable allele, so that made them black, and this caused a gradual increase in the proportion of dark moths until light moths became very rare in industrial areas. The moth population in these areas had evolved. This change from predominantly light to dark forms in industrial areas is called industrial melanism. Note that the change was not due to pollution making the moths darker. The dark variety has always existed in small numbers, but only had a selective advantage when the selection pressure changed. Basically, it wasn't just because the moth was covered in soot, it actually is dark coloured moth. Here is a simulation where you can look at exactly how natural selection affected the peppered moth. So obviously when the tree bark is brown with moss, the light version of the peppered moth has got the selective advantage. But if the tree bark is covered in soot, then it's the melanic form that will have the selective advantage. And this is due to the camouflaging. So let's see if we can answer this SQA question, which says, the diagram below shows the light and dark varieties of peppered moth. So you've got pictures of the moth. In an investigation involving marking, releasing and recapturing these moths in the countryside, the following results were obtained. So you've got your variety, and in light colour you marked 300 and released them, and you captured 180. And then for the dark colour you released and marked 300, and then you recaptured 100. So you recaptured more light coloured moths, and you're going to get asked, why did you manage to recapture more light moths than dark moths? So think about the answer to the question before you go to the next part of the video. So the question is, explain why more light coloured moths were recaptured, and then predict how the results would differ if the investigation was carried out in an industrial area. So pause the video and make sure you answer the questions before I go over it. So the answer is, the light moths would be more camouflaged on the bark of the tree, which blend in with the lichen, as there is less pollution, so there would be less predators, birds, that could see them. The predators, birds, are more likely to eat the dark coloured moths as they are easier to see. So basically, the light moths could camouflage, couldn't be seen by predators. Predict how the results would differ if the investigation was carried out in an industrial area. The answer is that more melanic dark moths would be recaptured, as they would be camouflaged by the dark bark that was covered in soot. So less birds would see them and eat them, so they would be able to be recaptured. And the birds would eat more of the light moths as they are easier seen on the dark bark. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, go back to the start of the video. Another place we can see natural selection in action that the SQA like to ask about is antibiotic resistance. So for antibiotic resistance to occur, firstly, one mutant bacteria arrives spontaneously in the population, because obviously mutations are rare and spontaneous. Then the mutant bacteria has the selective advantage and survives. This mutant resistant bacteria then reproduces to make more resistant bacteria because of its selective advantage. And then one of these bacteria may be resistant to a second antibiotic. Then the resistant bacteria has a selective advantage and survives to reproduce more bacteria that are resistant. So antibiotic resistance is quite a major problem for us, so let's look at it in diagram form. So if somebody coughs or sneezes on you and the bacteria lands on you, and off I go to infect a new human. So a few minutes later in a human respiratory tract not far away, you've got lots of little bacteria showing up. Oh look, there's a random spontaneous mutant. So that mutant is then going to be resistant to the antibiotic and it's going to have the selective advantage. And the bacteria is going to reproduce and reproduce and reproduce. And the person is then going to get very ill. So the person's going to go to their doctor, they're going to be prescribed with antibiotics, the person's going to take the antibiotics, and then all of the bacteria that are not resistant to the antibiotic will die, but the bacteria that are resistant to the antibiotic will survive. Now, if you complete your course of antibiotics, then your body should be able to fight off these resistant bacteria as there's not very many of them. But if you don't complete your antibiotics, then these bacteria get the chance to spread, so they multiply, and then you get lots and lots of bacteria. And then you get a mutant, and the person is ill. So what do you think is going to happen next after the person gets their antibiotics? Well, it'll be the same thing that happened last. Sex is not limited to the world of cells with nuclei. Even though they have no nuclei, bacteria can have sex too. But bacteria don't make sperm and eggs, they conjugate, which simply means that they swap bits of DNA alleles. They're not fussy about species either, they'll just conjugate with anyone. So, in theory, if a resistant sore throat causing bacterium meets a cholera causing bacterium, what might happen? So, you've got your little two bacteria meeting. So, ooh, hi babes, my name's cholera. Fancy a little conjugation? So obviously, it would end up with them both being resistant to the antibiotic. Antibiotic resistance is a major problem for us, and it's going to get a bigger and bigger problem as more and more bacteria start to become resistant to antibiotics. So necrotizing fasciitis may be caused by methicillin-resistant Streptococcus aureus, so MRSA. So the bacteria was first spotted in 1961 and has since then mutated and developed resistance to almost all B-lactam antibiotics, which means that the stronger antibiotics must be used. So the bacteria are reported to be responsible for around 19,000 deaths each year in the USA. The bacteria can be spread through skin and body fluids contact as well as indirect contact, such as from coins, toys, etc. So MRSA causes skin and tissue infections and starts at the skin as a small rash that then develops into an open wound. So don't take antibiotics if you don't need them, and if you do, make sure you finish the course so you don't end up with lots of resistant bacteria. Now let's review your knowledge so far. So let's see if we can answer this SQA question, which says the overuse of antibiotics has caused populations of antibiotic-resistant bacteria to evolve. The stages in their evolution are described in the table. So we've got A, random mutations in bacteria make some of the bacteria antibiotic resistant. B, the next generation of bacteria are antibiotic resistant. C, the surviving bacteria reproduce and pass on the alleles for antibiotic resistance to their offspring. D. Bacterial populations show genetic variation. E. When antibiotics are used, the non-resistant bacteria are killed and the resistant bacteria survive. It then says place letters from the table in the boxes to show the order of the stages describing how populations of bacteria become resistant to antibiotics. The first stage has been completed for you. The next question says name the process by which the bacteria best adapted to their environment survive and reproduce. And the last question says name an environmental factor that can increase the rate of mutations. So pause the video and try to come up with the answers before I go over it. So the answer would be that it goes D, bacterial populations show genetic variation. And then it would be A, so random mutations in bacteria make some of the bacteria antibiotic resistant. Then it would be E, when antibiotics are used, non-resistant bacteria are killed and the resistant bacteria survive. Then it would be C, the surviving bacteria reproduce and pass on their alleles for antibiotic resistance to their offspring. And then it would be B, the next generation of bacteria are antibiotic resistant. So well done if you managed to get that one correct. Then the process by which the bacteria that are best adapted to their environment survive and reproduce would be natural selection. And name an environmental factor that can cause increase in rate of mutations. That would be radiation and chemicals. And you could have given an example of radiation like X-ray and an example of chemicals like mustard gas. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If you didn't, then you need to go back and watch this video again. Let's now look at speciation. So pause the video and try to write out the definition for a species before I go over the answers. The answer is that a species is a group of organisms that can interbreed to produce fertile offspring. You also need to know the word speciation. So speciation is the formation of new species, and you need to know that evolution is the mechanism by which speciation is brought about. So make sure you know this before you move on to the next part of the video. Speciation requires some sort of isolation barrier. An isolation barrier is something that causes the original population to become divided and stops genetic drift, so it stops the genes mixing. These barriers can be geographical, so for example seas, rivers and mountains, ecological, for example temperature, water availability and pH, or behavioural, so for example sex cells unable to fuse, unsuccessful mating displays, or flowering at different times of year. So make sure you learn all of this information about isolation barriers before you move on to the next part. So it's very important you know what speciation barriers are and you know why they're used and you know examples of them. So make sure you know that before you go on to the next part of the video. So the first part of speciation, we have a large interbreeding population of one species, so for example camels. Then the second part of speciation is where it needs to be the population or species needs to be isolated by a barrier. So for example, this can be a geographical barrier such as an ocean. And the next part of speciation is that the population is now split into two isolated subpopulations that can no longer mix. Then mutations occur at random in both populations, and both populations will have different selective pressure. So for example, one might be a warm place and one might be a cold place. So natural selection is going to affect each subpopulation in different ways. And in over hundreds of years, the two populations adapt in different ways. So the two groups become so genetically distinct and isolated that even if you remove the isolation barrier, they are no longer able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So speciation has occurred. And two distinct species have evolved. So let's summarise this process in the one diagram. So you have your large population with your common gene pool at the very top. And then you need your population separated by an isolation barrier. So for example, this is geographical and it's a mountain that's been put. And then you have two different subpopulations formed. Then you've got different mutations occur in each new subpopulation. So your variation is displayed in each new population, and natural selection occurs when those with the selective advantage will survive and pass on their genes. So on this side, your selective pressure is temperature. So the temperature must be cold, so the hairy form has the selective advantage. So the hairy allele will be more and more frequent. On this other side, selection pressure is predation, so completely different selection pressure. and the blue have the select advantage, so the blue are going to become more and more frequent. So after a very long period of time, so after many generations, the mutations and natural selection changing the gene pool of each population, even if the isolation barrier is then removed, these subgroups will no longer be able to interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So two new distinct species have been formed. So make sure you are able to write this out and know the process of speciation off by heart before you move on to the next part of this video. Here is a summary paragraph of speciation. Make sure you learn it before you move on to the next part of the video. It says that speciation occurs after part of a population becomes isolated by an isolation barrier, which can be geographical, ecological, or behavioral. Different mutations occur in each of these subpopulations. Natural selection selects for different mutations in each group due to different selection pressures. Each subpopulation evolves until they become so genetically different that they are two different species. So make sure you write this out over and over again and learn it off by heart. You can try to make it into a word mnemonic, so you can have isolation, mutation, natural selection, and then evolution. So if you make a mnemonic with the start, like with the first letter of each of these words, you might be able to remember it better. So remember, say it over and over again, write it out over and over again, but make sure you know it before you move on to the next part of this video. Usually in class we would do the club activity. You can find this in consumable 6.4. So you need to read and follow the instructions on flump speciation. This is a made up creature. Then you must use the terms isolation, mutation and natural selection when describing the process of speciation. Try to complete this activity before you move on to the next part of this video. So let's review our knowledge and see if we can do this SQA question on speciation, which says the diagram represents a population of animals. The following diagram shows the stages of speciation occurring from this population. The correct order of the stages of speciation is. So pause the video and try to answer the question before I go over the answers. So the answer would be that we have to start off with the isolation barrier, so that would be Y. And then we have to have a mutant in our population, so that would be X. And then natural selection would cause this mutant favourable characteristics to be passed on, so that would then lead to Z. And then we would have, even although our barrier was removed, our species would be too genetically different and they would no longer be able to reproduce to produce fertile offspring. So we would have Y, X, Z, and then W. So the answer would be C. So well done if you managed to get that correct. If not, then you need to go back and watch the video again. So last question to answer, but it's a 4 marker. So let's see if we can answer this SQA question, which says the following diagram shows the stages in the formation of a new species. Using the information in the diagram, describe how new species are formed. So pause the video and write down the answer before I go over the answer. And remember, you need 4 points because it's worth 4 marks. So the answer is the initial population is separated by an isolation barrier, and then you needed different mutations occur in each subpopulation group, and then you needed some mutations are more advantageous than others, so natural selection occurs or selection pressures are different in each group, or advantageous mutations are selected for. And then the last point that you needed to make was that over generations the populations become so different from each other that even when the barrier is removed, they can no longer interbreed to produce fertile offspring. So well done if you managed to get all 4 marks. If you didn't, go back and watch this video again. Remember, natural selection and speciation are very important to know. You should now be able to do the key area evolution of a species past paper questions and the life on earth exam practice questions on page 73 to 77. We have now come to the end of the lesson. You should now be able to explain the different stages of natural selection and be able to put them in order, and explain the different stages of speciation and be able to put them in order. Well done if you can confidently do all of that. If you can't, then you'll need to watch the video again. That is the end of the video tutorials and the end of the National 5 course. Yahoo! Thank you for listening. Happy revising.